Chapter 9. The COP Conundrum. A flawed global mechanism, or the best there is to forge a path to net zero emissions? For almost 30 years, the United Nations has brought together more than 190 countries from every corner of planet Earth for a climate summit known as a Conference of the Parties, COP, in an attempt to forge collective action in curbing carbon emissions. A climate COP staged under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, looks, at first glance, like a recipe for chaos. With upwards of 25,000 people gathered annually in one place, there are numerous briefings, report launches, press conferences, protests, stunts, corporates trying to show off their newfound green credentials, and harrowing stories of climate disruption from morning into late evening in crowded venues, with many happening simultaneously. 1 minute, a minister is trying to defend his country's expansionist fossil fuel policy. The next, a pastor from Fiji is making a plea for help, as a voyager way of life existing for centuries is threatened by rising seas. Or climate activist Greta Thunberg is delivering her latest curt but withering condemnation of dithering politicians, which resonates far beyond the venue. Meanwhile, the political process is running in tandem. Political leaders, including many heads of state, arrive for the opening days. Many commit to greater ambition. Increasingly, they call for collective action and acknowledge the extent of the climate and biodiversity emergencies threatening the Earth. Most of them leave, and hard negotiations begin behind closed doors with ministers, public servants, scientific advisors, and diplomats. Some will return for the conclusion almost 2 weeks later, especially if it's regarded as a good outcome politically. Among those ensconced away from the madding crowd, optimism is more tempered, and commitments are subject to more intense scrutiny. Painstaking work is conducted as the mood ebbs and flows in pursuit of agreement. Initially, talks can be quite technical, as the latest scientific evidence is evaluated. Going into the second week, it is beginning to become clear whether significant progress is being made or not. If they are deadlocked, the blame game begins, even before the formal closing session. The big power blocs of the European Union, the United States, and China, the largest economic power blocs, have a major role in pushing for tangible progress. If they are not at one, the herding of the other countries in the right direction becomes difficult. They also happen to be the world's biggest emitters, historically and currently, though overall levels in Europe and the US are declining. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs, are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and the achievement of its long-term goals. They embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. As they are the main indicator of commitments and mitigation progress, they feature prominently in COP negotiations. Separately, alliances are formed by individual countries on particular issues. It is an attempt to build momentum with leader countries making big commitments in an effort to get others on board. In, for instance, getting out of coal, addressing deforestation, or curbing methane, which is 85 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, GHG, when first emitted. These are small wins, given the bigger picture, but they build a moral imperative that can become a force for change as others are persuaded to join later. Least developed countries, LDCs, including small island developing states, SIDS, who have contributed least to a warming world and yet are most vulnerable to climate disruption, push repeatedly for their voices to be heard. Frequently, meaningful progress is within touching distance, but then the watering down of the text begins. For many years, countries heavily dependent on fossil fuels, such as Saudi Arabia and Russia, and those with populist leaders doubling up as climate deniers, such as Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, and the US under Donald Trump, stuck their oars in. COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 left a particularly bad taste in the mouth. After pressure exerted by India and China, the wording of the final deal was watered down to a pledge to phase down rather than phase out coal. COP26 President Alok Sharma was on the brink of tears as he explained what had happened, and the last-minute alteration brought sharp words of rebuke from the US, under President Joe Biden and climate envoy John Kerry, and other nations. They may be imperfect and cumbersome in tackling climate change, yet sometimes they get big stuff done. COP3 in 1997 delivered the Kyoto Protocol, an international treaty committing parties to reduce greenhouse gases, and COP21 generated the 2015 Paris Agreement, a great monument to multilateralism that has proven to be a robust indicator of the direction of travel needed. But the world needs to move beyond promises to act. It needs to secure more urgency in the face of an existential threat to humanity and the dangerous decline of nature. A fully fledged COP with substantive outcomes somehow restores faith in humanity. Instead of unbridgeable differences, there is common ground, suggesting global citizens can act in unison and restore a scarred Earth, though the climate change clock is ticking faster and faster. All too often, however, the outcome has meant bitter disappointment and, more recently, despair, as the interlinked crises of a climate emergency, accelerating biodiversity loss, and gross pollution arising from the excess of consumerism worsen. Meanwhile, a new type of research, known as attribution science, is examining whether climate change has made particular extreme events more severe and more likely to occur, and if so, by how much. This is increasingly the case. Then there is the slow, remorseless rise in sea levels that will take centuries to reverse, adding to anxiety. The Denman ice shelf in East Antarctica is melting at a rate of 70.8 billion tonnes a year and holds a volume of ice equivalent to 1.5 metres of sea level rise. Just one portent matched by others in the Arctic, such as the demise of Greenland's ice sheet. In addition, many glaciers are disappearing, often with no possibility of recovering. They have passed a tipping point, with melting set to continue for hundreds, if not thousands, of years, with major implications for water security. The reality is that the Paris Agreement left too much to interpretation, the consequence of a political fudge to get the deal over the line. It has failed to provide a reliable, binding mechanism to drive urgent and sustained action, and to ensure delivery in spite of promises to do so. Increased commitments have been only partially delivered, at best. There was a feeling at COP26 that perhaps the wrong people were in the negotiating room. There was a notable absence of young voices, the generation who are going to be worst affected by anthropogenic warming, and who often display a better understanding of it than a great many older politicians. As the leading climate activist and chair of the Elders, Mary Robinson noted, It had a feel of being too white and elite and sanitised, with most climate activists kept well away and under constant observation by hundreds of police officers, imposing tight security across the city. Mohammed Rafi Arifin, assistant professor of geography at the University of British Columbia, who has researched urban environmental politics in Egypt, has pointed out that every United Nations climate summit presents a complex calculus of costs and benefits. As Naomi Klein noted in a seminal piece published by The Intercept in advance of COP27 in Egypt, on the negative side, there is the carbon spewed into the atmosphere as delegates travel there. The price of 2 weeks of hotels, steep for grassroots organisations, as well as the public relations bonanza enjoyed by the host government, which invariably positions itself as an eco-champion, never mind evidence to the contrary. We saw this when coal-addled Poland played host in 2018, and we saw it when France did the same in 2015, despite Total Energy's oil rigs around the world. Those are typical negatives enmeshed in the COP tradition. On the positive side of the ledger, Klein observed, there is the fact that, for 2 weeks in November every year, the climate crisis makes global news, often providing media platforms for powerful voices on the front lines of climate disruption, from the Brazilian Amazon to Tuvalu. Another plus, she believed, was the international networking and solidarity that takes place when local organisers in the host country stage counter-summits and toxic tours to reveal the reality behind their government's green posturing. And of course, there are the deals that get negotiated and funds that are pledged to the poorest and worst impacted. But these are non-binding, and as Greta Thunberg so memorably put it, much of what has been pledged and announced has amounted to little more than blah blah blah. Staging COP27 in an authoritarian country with an appalling human rights record brought an unwelcome dimension, Klein concluded. Blood, blood, blood. The Abdel Fattah el-Sisi regime continues to jail the blogger Alaa Abd el-Fattah, a British citizen and arguably Egypt's highest-profile political prisoner, who was convicted of public dissent in 2014. Abd el-Fattah may not specifically identify as an environmentalist, Bill McKibben noted in The New Yorker, July 2022, but he clearly understands that, absent a responsive government, it's hard to achieve any change in a society's status quo. In this way, he's absolutely emblematic of the kind of activism that has propelled the climate fight, pushing governments and corporations far beyond where they want to go. If that activism ceases, so too will the prospect for change at the speed that is required, he added, while noting that the overlap between authoritarian governments and fossil fuel production and deforestation is pretty clear. All this prompts two fundamental questions. Is the COP process the best we have got? And so should we proceed on that basis? If the COP process is not fit for purpose, what improvements are possible to ensure more effective and timely global action? The process is a victim of its own politics and procedures, according to long-time observer of COPs, Sive O'Neill, a researcher in climate policy and politics. Every major decision, the kind that the public would expect, such as mandatory emission reduction targets and financial commitments, are either politically infeasible at present or require years of preparatory dialogue. All decisions are made using a consensus rule. There are no procedures in place to take qualified majority votes. Byzantine procedures and processes that the parties to the UNFCCC operate under overlap with similar decision-making bodies for the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, along with two subsidiary bodies that are enormously powerful, SBI and SBSTA. Overall, it's a very unwieldy and cumbersome decision-making mechanism for what is a planetary emergency, O'Neill believes. The climate COP, nonetheless, becomes a focal point for media coverage of climate change and for the global climate movement. But it's hard to build the traditional kinds of pressure that yields a shift in decision-making. The lead-in times are very long. Delays in delivering and implementing agreed measures under the Paris Agreement undermine the confidence that developing countries have that their development needs will be met, O'Neill adds. At least the COP is an opportunity for the international community and for UN agencies to give climate change all their attention and focus. It's an opportunity for naming and shaming laggards and drawing attention to the inevitable emissions gap between committed emissions and the 1.5/2 degrees Celsius targets, she says. Climate policy specialist Professor Dermot Torney of Dublin City University acknowledges significant problems with the UNFCCC/COP process. If we measure the achievements of the UNFCCC against any reasonable benchmark, it is hard to argue that it has been a success. Emissions since the early 1990s, when the UN climate negotiations commenced, have gone in only one direction, he concludes. Successive COPs have shone a light on the climate problem and provided a venue for ongoing negotiations. But the fundamental problem is that countries' perceptions of their core interests are not currently aligned with anything like the kind of radical action needed to effectively address the climate crisis, Torney says. Far from being a failed entity, the UNFCCC is a crucial multilateral process for developing a framework for state-led action on climate change within the UN system, says Trócaire Head of Policy and Advocacy, Siobhan Curran. As such, it provides a critical framework for responding to the climate emergency. She accepts that there is a major gap in leadership by governments in addressing the climate crisis with the urgency and at scale required. It is crucial to address the gap between the global framework and national action, including progress towards achieving national mitigation pledges and the Paris Agreement goals. Moreover, wealthy states have to deliver on climate finance, particularly adaptation finance, to build resilience in the face of inevitable impacts, and to provide a new loss and damage finance facility. This requires leadership and action by governments between COPs, and sustained political pressure from people, communities, and movements. There needs to be increased scrutiny on states on the extent to which they are meeting the Paris Agreement, and pressure to deliver just and human rights-based climate action, Curran adds. Consistent scrutiny on COP outcomes and robust analysis of progress, along with challenging corporate power, are all vital elements to this process. As a key lever, NDCs need to deliver more and deeper pledges, according to Paul Patrick Walsh, Vice President of Education at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, and Professor of International Development Studies at University College Dublin. Countries must reduce emissions at least 6 times as much as current pledges. While current levels of climate finance are insufficient in rich countries to implement their pledges, Walsh says. Moreover, no nation-state is safe until all nations are safe. Yet nation-state pledges to NDCs only add up to the global target if all nations achieve net zero by 2050. Notably, the finance deficit of least developed countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, SIDS, is a big problem for the overall global target. Already adaptation is using up more resources than mitigation, he says. Only 15 of the 120 Global Methane Pledge signatory countries include a specific, quantified methane reduction target in their NDCs in 2022. 40 countries have committed to shift away from coal in pledges made at the COP26 Climate Summit. But some of the world's biggest coal-dependent countries, including China and the US, did not sign up, Walsh notes. In addition, NDCs are slow to recognise the importance of transformation of sectors, including energy, reinforced by a just transition for workers, he says. Schumpeterian waves of structural change need to be dealt with by political action. Phase in new companies, phase out the old. Upskill, reskill, or skill workers for green jobs. This is about a need to support getting to the end line and not just worry about losses on the baseline. In O'Neill's view, the sprawling agenda of the 2015 Paris Agreement is not helping to deliver either climate justice or mitigation. Every year, we get more and more blah 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 and not enough concrete action. The NDCs are not delivering the mitigation that is required, and there are no mandatory financial contributions, she adds. There is a need to revisit the model of the Montreal Protocol and to devise new protocols under the UNFCCC targeting emission reductions on a gas-by-gas basis, as well as deforestation. Not easy, but it would target the sources of GHGs. Similarly, the proposal for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty should be supported by the Irish government at the UN or under the auspices of the UNFCCC, she says. In addition, targeted emission reductions that are matched with longer lead-in times and financial supports to developing countries have long been recognised as key to global mitigation. Is there an appetite for negotiating new protocols? Perhaps not at the moment, but it is inevitable that the global stocktake due to commence in 2023 is going to highlight serious shortcomings with the current approach. The shortfall was highlighted in a 2021 UNEP emissions gap report. G20 members, responsible for 80% of global emissions, as a group do not have policies in place to achieve even the NDCs, much less net zero. European nations are supposed to be taking the lead, but, like Ireland, most are dragging their feet, O'Neill says. Emissions have rapidly rebounded post-COVID, and the climate measures and policies in place in Europe are wholly insufficient to deliver the 10 to 15% annual cuts that are recommended by leading climate scientists such as Kevin Anderson and John Broderick. Could compulsory requirements be adopted, rather than voluntary commitments, allied to naming and shaming laggards? This gets to the core of the problem. There isn't really a viable alternative, Torney believes. The structure of the international system is such that there is no realistic possibility of a system of compulsory requirements, a system with teeth. This is because if a country really doesn't like an international treaty, it can withdraw. Just look at Brexit. We thought the EU was a stable, rules-based order, but ultimately, if a country doesn't like the rules, they can quit the club. So I think we are stuck with roughly the system we have, he says. The COP is an essential mechanism to drive urgent actions and to ensure state accountability in the face of the climate catastrophe, Curran says. However, there are other potential legislative tools that could be pursued to enhance climate action. She also favours a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to address gaps in the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC governance. Separately, the appointment of a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change and recognition by the UN General Assembly of a human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment have also been extremely important developments, she says. Urgent implementation of this right is critical in light of the accelerating environmental crisis and the continued oppression and persecution of environmental human rights defenders by governments and corporate actors. The forthcoming EU directive on corporate sustainability and due diligence is aimed at cleaning up global supply chains and minimising the negative global impacts of business on workers, communities, and the environment. This is an important opportunity to ensure that those who profit from human rights and environmental violations are held to account, and that affected communities can access justice. This directive covers both human rights and the environment, recognising the link between the two, and introduces mandatory climate transition plans for some companies. Curran points out. The draft rules would force large companies to adopt a climate transition plan in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement. This would be a very significant step in extending the Paris obligations beyond states to corporations and could have a serious impact on the biggest polluters in Europe. In terms of a better way, Walsh again focuses in on NDCs, most of which are based on energy transitions, transportation, and sector contributions to GHG reductions within a nation-state. The problem is energy and goods and services are mainly imported and exported, transported, across nation-states, he says. While important infrastructure enables this, including grids, pipelines, and cables, these leakages/spillovers are more than 66% of the problem and not addressed in NDCs, Walsh underlines. Multilateral policy approaches of monitoring and enforcement need to happen. Multilateral institutions are weak, and increasingly so during a time of war, yet markets for finance, energy, and commodities are global. When the global digital and physical highways break down and need to be protected with security spending, we see energy and commodity prices booming amid great uncertainty. These need to be rebuilt, but for movements of renewable energy and sustainable commodities, Walsh suggests. Most NDCs will need political will, i.e. policy, new technologies, and increased finance to implement pledges. For these to work and be viable, they need to be pooled across nations and go to scale. Most renewable technology needs to plug into the grids and global markets to be viable, as does fossil fuel. Walsh points to a need to look at SDG 17, the UN Sustainable Development Goal, which calls for international partnerships to manage the global movement of renewable energy and commodities. The uncoordinated and decentralized nation-state approach is going to fail by design, he predicts. Multinationals' global value chain commitments internalize spillovers, but add nothing to the NDCs. In such circumstances, there is a requirement for new global institutions. An OPEC for renewable energies, for example, Walsh believes. Global regulatory and competition authorities also need to be put in place, but he accepts all this is easier said than done. At COP27, all the same issues, including a cumbersome decision-making process, surfaced repeatedly. In spite of this, there was a historic breakthrough, setting up a loss and damage fund, whereby wealthy countries will soon support poorer, climate-vulnerable states with vastly scaled-up funding, especially to help them withstand the inevitable impacts from a warming world. This a key part of addressing climate injustice. The gathering added momentum to the push for reform of the global financial system to free up green finance for developing countries. But there was a deplorable failure by governments to scale up mitigation commitments, yet another indication that the system is incapable of reaching effective decisions speedily, even in the course of a worsening climate crisis, where the international community has been unable to ward off imminent disaster. On balance, a pragmatic approach requires reform within. This should be led by the UN and the parties through a joint Global North, Global South initiative to ensure the outcome is underpinned by equity. Change should not undermine what is achieved outside the negotiation room through the interaction of policymakers from other levels of government, regions, cities, businesses, civil society, including Indigenous people, and climate/environmental NGOs. These engagements frequently lead to important multilateral agreements, collaboration that overcomes the usual political barriers to action, or side deals of substance. They are often overlooked because the news focus is mostly on the final COP agreement. They are critical socio-political events, which are often of global significance. They enhance discourse about climate policy, frequently apply pressure on climate-laggard governments, and their outcomes feed into a plethora of movements campaigning for a coordinated response in pulling the world back from climate breakdown. The world is in a climate emergency. There is a code red for humanity, according to the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres. The concentration of GHG emissions in the atmosphere is wreaking havoc across the world and threatening lives, economies, health, and food. The world is far from securing a global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, as promised in the Paris Agreement. With a baseline in 1990, some countries are emitting more. Some are the same, and others are emitting less. A haphazard collective response at best. Guterres has repeatedly called for a coalition of the world to tackle the challenges ahead. This should also apply to recasting the COP process urgently, rather than scuttling it and attempting to build a different multilateral model from scratch. It has to be reinforced by greater robustness and transparency, and infused with elevated ambition. Reform must mean better delivery of climate action by wealthy countries, while ensuring those most exposed to an overheating world are made resilient and adequately compensated for the sins of historical and ongoing emissions from within the developed world. What Guterres refers to as the battle of our lives requires a separate international alliance operating closely in parallel with the UNFCCC policy platform, applying big ideas, new thinking, and disruptive approaches to decarbonising the world through electrification without borders. Therefore, we gathered world leaders and key stakeholders in Dublin in May 2021 in an effort to mobilise action through the Dublin Climate Dialogues Initiative in advance of COP26, which was being billed as the Last Chance COP. In opening the dialogues, US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, predicted the transition to climate neutrality is going to be the biggest economic transformation that any of us have seen. Mindful of unfinished business, he added, even if everyone in the world, national government, multilateral institutions, companies, hit the current goals on climate, and we do so on time, that will still not be enough to halt global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The truth is, we are just not getting the job done yet. In a segment on speeding up the transition and the benefits that it will bring to all aspects of life on Earth, Chief Commercial Officer of Supernode, Robert O'Connor, underlined that addressing climate change and increasing global welfare were not each other's opposites. There is a net global benefit in the range of $400 trillion. This is a great outcome, but it requires coordinated improvement in the energy system to be achieved. In practice, this also requires disincentives or penalties for nations and companies who undermine the process. The collective response must come from the most powerful governments in alliance with the poorest countries, the big corporations and the small businesses, local communities and individuals. This is not someone else's problem, it's ours. We are not bystanders. Each in our own way is an actor in this great human and planetary drama. Dialogue's chair, Pat Cox, former European Parliament President, noted on finalisation of the Dublin Declaration, a call for global action in advance of COP26. The initiative's emphatic message was that through stakeholders working together and by harnessing innovative technologies, the global transformation to clean energy can happen. Critically, within Europe, the supergrid can be the great enabler. Stalled COP process. Professor John Sweeney of Maynooth University, a veteran of 13 COPs, says in recent years the seriousness of the climate crisis is not reflected in the urgency shown by the negotiators. Delegations are broken up into segments where individuals are given restricted briefs, for instance on adaptation, and their mandate is frequently circumscribed by their heads of delegation. Often it is a defensive one, rather than a progressive or radical one. This is particularly the case for authoritarian states, when concessions could be consequential for some negotiators. COP27 in 2022 exhibited the classic division between rich and poor countries that has bedevilled progress going on for 3 decades now, he suggests. Essentially, the Global South comes looking for financial assistance to cope or develop or adapt, while the Global North, with some exceptions, is wary of transferring funds, suspecting they may be misused or become a precedent for ramping up the true scale of reparations necessary on a historical basis. Agreement on the Loss and Damage (L&D) Fund, a financial mechanism designed to provide crucial support to vulnerable nations facing the brunt of climate-related challenges, was something that the G77 group of countries and the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, has been seeking for many years. His feeling, however, is that the Egyptian chair, known as the COP president, was willing to support this, knowing the practicalities of establishing the criteria would take several COPs to further flesh out. It also was something that the petrostates could point to, in the knowledge that it would be the G20 that would be the primary contributors. COP28 in 2023 surprisingly made progress on this front on day one, which took a lot of delegations by surprise. The UAE chair, Sultan Al Jaber, had been receiving all sorts of negative publicity in advance of the Dubai meeting and needed an early win to provide any momentum and take the focus off his alleged conflict of interests. He is head of the UAE state oil company, ADNOC. It seems to me that the interventions by Mary Robinson, challenging Al Jaber on the science of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the press reports of negotiations with African countries to develop their oil and gas reserves, allegedly taking place during the conference, took away this early momentum. But the announcement of L&D pledges and subsequent formation of the L&D board was undoubtedly the main positive outcome. Credit for a lot of this has to go to the work of Ireland's Climate Director, Sinead Walsh, of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Her name kept cropping up whenever the topic was mentioned in Dubai, Sweeney says. But in reality, although a simplistic methodology for dispersing funds seems to have been agreed, he says, the squabbling will be long-lasting over what events are climate change related and which countries should contribute to the fund. Resolving this could take some time, he adds. Witness the decade-long wrangle over LULUCF, land use change, and forestry, in the Paris Agreement. Rich countries and petrostates will throw money at the problem in increasingly large amounts to avoid internal social opposition and making the lifestyle changes necessary. The COP28 statement on fossil fuels, committing to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science, is fairly typical COP language, he adds. A compromise that commits nobody to doing anything soon, but nonetheless is a small bit of progress. Unfortunately, we regularly see countries signing up to global emission reductions in areas such as methane without accepting the agreement applies to them at a national level. Ireland's commitment to a global reduction in methane emissions of 30% by 2030 is a good example. A few exceptions exist, he says. As usual, the Nordic countries lead the way, e.g. the climate minister from Denmark called on the EU to achieve a 90% emission reduction by 2040, the first country to do so. Some of the developing countries also are shining lights, such as the Solomon Islands. Saving 1.5 degrees Celsius became a mantra at COP26. Less so at COP28 when the IPCC declared it almost beyond reach. Sweeney predicts, no doubt saving 2 degrees Celsius will become the next mantra. But the NDCs are widely flouted. We still see comments such as carbon intensity and reductions relative to business as usual and carefully selected baselines. All this came from the Paris Radical Change and Direction, which instead of seeking a target to impose on countries like Kyoto, asked them to set their own target based on the UNFCCC principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. He highlights persistent difficulties regarding negotiating blocs, which date from an era, 1964, when the economic makeup of the world was very different to today. China, for example, is not really a suitable member of the G77 group. Neither is, for example, Saudi Arabia or Singapore. The conflicting interests of such an unwieldy group doesn't help progress being made. It is quite surprising that the G77 themselves have not made progress in reforming their membership because they can't talk with one voice to any extent. Sweeney predicted progress at COP29 in Baku would not be major. There will be a big push for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, now gaining some traction, even among Irish local authorities. Rather, it seems to be COP30 in Brazil that is being held up as the next big opportunity. In the meantime, the rules of engagement will remain the same, he says. The slow extension of carbon border adjustments promised by the EU is one way of getting the problem of climate change into the economic arena, while the unspoken fear of a trade war has stifled debate in this area. Ultimately, it may be through the World Trade Organization that COP makes progress. Above all, the cumbersome nature of COPs in making any progress due to the unanimity rule stands out, Sweeney says. This has been the root cause of 28 years of COP failure to take decisive steps to tackle the problem. Attempts are regularly made to change the voting system, but these always flounder. If a system of qualified majority were to be adopted, or even a system such as the Borda voting system, based around finding consensus, it could unlock the logjam, he believes. Another factor that has heightened discussion on reining in the COP process is logistical constraints and capacity issues at COP29 and COP30. The ever-escalating size of COPs up to now and difficulties at gatherings in Baku and Brazil is pushing the case for smaller gatherings. The prospect of scaling back has been raised by UN climate chief Simon Steele, who said he hopes to see fewer people after participants at COP28 in Dubai hit a record high of nearly 84,000 people. He told an audience at London's Chatham House think tank he personally would like to see future COPs reduce in size, as bigger doesn't necessarily mean better. Size does not necessarily translate to the quality of outcomes, Steele said, noting the UN Climate Change Secretariat is discussing the issue with the COP29 and COP30 hosts. Climate Home News visited the host cities of Baku and Belém to see how preparations were going for the 2024 and 2025 gatherings. Azerbaijan's government was expecting just 40,000 people to come to Baku Olympic Stadium this year, with temporary structures built nearby to accommodate negotiations and side events, while Belém's remoteness, congested roads, and lack of hotels are likely to substantially limit how many people can attend. On Belém, which is in northern Brazil, near the Amazon rainforest, Steele said he was actively discussing with the Brazilians how we can reduce the size of the COP so that the logistics of it can be supported at that hosted destination. It is expecting 40,000 to 50,000 people, but there are concerns the city will struggle to cope. It is not a large tourist destination. The federal government, meanwhile, is reportedly considering hosting part of COP30 in bigger cities like Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. The remoteness of the location is likely to translate into a bigger carbon footprint for overseas delegates. While COPs have a sizable carbon footprint, researchers investigating misinformation have found this is often exaggerated by those trying to undermine climate action. Questioned about the issue, Steele replied, "At every COP, we get the reports, how many private planes and the CO2 footprint for hosting those COPs. But," he added, "taking a very pragmatic view, we need the right people around the table in order for this process to work, and there will be a cost to that. How you ensure that those that are present are the ones necessary to contribute positively to the process is also important." In the wake of the poor COP27 overall outcome, an open letter was sent in early 2023 to the UN Secretary-General by the Club of Rome, a platform of diverse thought leaders who identify holistic solutions to complex global issues and promote policy initiatives and action to enable humanity to emerge from multiple planetary emergencies. Among its signatories were Mary Robinson, former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, and Professor Lawrence Tubiana, former climate change ambassador for France, who played a critical role in getting the Paris Agreement across the line. It suggests a range of reforms would help the UNFCCC achieve the core objectives of COP gatherings, which is to avoid dangerous climate change by delivering the Paris Agreement. COP needs to be able to act in and respond to our current emergency situation and to respect the goal of Paris of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The focus now needs to be on delivery and action, sharing best practice, holding countries to account, and financing the transition, it added. COP should be based on science, and all delegations should be regularly updated about new developments, it added. Science shows urgent phasing out of fossil fuels is vital to achieving climate targets, in addition to the protection of nature, and must be at the heart of discussions under the aegis of the COP. Instead of one huge annual COP, the letter called for smaller, more frequent meetings to keep up momentum, focus on targeted deliverables, and ensure governments are not the only voices heard during official discussions. The current structure, with different zones separated from the negotiations, should be abandoned and the COP meeting repurposed to be reporting, accounting and working sessions. Non-state actor solutions and ideas need to be brought into the COP negotiations and not to be siloed in sideline events, including Indigenous people's voices and young change actors. Multilateral banks and financial institutions should have a central role in working sessions to ensure pledges become tangible, deliverable work plans, it said. All decisions and discussions should account for regional differences to ensure a just global transition. The COP process can set an example for transformational leadership, it believed, by supporting localised transition pathways, knowledge exchange, and technology co-development and international collaboration based on equity and empowerment. Its views were largely complemented by Pope Francis in his Laudate Deum statement, issued in advance of COP28, which sounded the alarm and urged strategists attending Dubai to be capable of considering the common good and the future of their children, more than the short-term interests of certain countries or businesses. To say that there is nothing to hope for at COP28 would be suicidal, for it would mean exposing all humanity, especially the poorest, to the worst impacts of climate change, he declared. In his statement, Pope Francis talked of the need to reconfigure multilateralism. Our world has become so multipolar, and at the same time so complex, that a different framework for effective cooperation is required. Within this new framework, there would be spaces for conversation, consultation, arbitration, conflict resolution, and supervision, a sort of increased democratization in the global context. The Club of Rome message had at its core that the UN needs to shift gear and focus all efforts on the delivery of global goals and commitments in the lead-up to 2050. And successful delivery requires an urgent reform of the COP process. The following November, however, just before Dubai, its co-president, Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, blogged, "I fear that COPs are becoming little more than a circus, with the petro-states as the ringmasters, and us, civil society, progressive business and financial institutions, heads of state and negotiators from countries wanting climate action, are the clowns. We smile manically as incremental promises and weak pledges are presented as progress." It should be acknowledged that agreement on the Loss and Damage Fund, an acceptance by France and other wealthy countries of the principles of the so-called Bridgetown Initiative to make the global financial system more shock-resistant in fighting climate-related disasters, which were fashioned out of the COP process, are significant. The latter proposes unblocking flows of private capital to developing countries so they can accelerate climate change mitigation and adaptation. Pushed through the unrelenting efforts of the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, it recognises we need to ramp up long-term, low-cost lending to their governments so that they can make their citizens, communities and countries more resilient to the consequences of an overheating world. It highlights the need to find new, non-debt resources to finance post-disaster reconstruction, backed by urgent reforms to the global financial architecture to meet these objectives. And it calls for a tripling of concessional loans and grants to the world's poorest countries. Critical to this is maximising the availability and use of resources that can be leveraged most, capital from multilateral development banks. Those successes aside, it should be a source of immense concern that progress since has been pitiful. Given some of the most prominent climate scientists under the IPCC say we are roaring to a world of 2.5 degrees Celsius this century, and the spectre of an unlivable planet. This is in a scenario where climate tipping points loom ever nearer, and extreme weather events exacerbated by human-induced global warming are rapidly becoming the new norm. Chapter Key Points 1. As a multilateral process, the Climate COP brings together all world governments and keeps the focus on climate catastrophe. 2. It is ineffective insofar as unanimity of nations is required. There is no concept of qualified majority decision-making. 3. It is largely unrepresentative of young people and future generations who will be deeply affected by the unfolding catastrophe. 4. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs, embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and are a yardstick of progress. 5. At COP meetings, least developed countries and small island states, which are most affected by global warming and have contributed least to emitting greenhouse gases, get to air their views and seek compensation. 6. Byzantine procedures make for unwieldy decision-making. 7. By any benchmark, the COP has not been very successful. Emissions continue to rise. 8. A global stocktake in 2023 confirmed the emissions gap between current greenhouse gas emissions and what is required for decarbonisation and ultimately net zero. 9. G20 members, responsible for 80% of global emissions as a group, do not have policies in place to achieve their NDCs, much less net zero. 10. The COP is a deeply flawed process, but the only one we have got. 11. Despite its shortcomings, it recently secured agreement on the landmark Loss and Damage Fund, while the Bridgetown initiative to overhaul the global financial system to support climate-vulnerable countries emerged from the COP process. It is gaining increased support from wealthy countries.